With that, I do want to keep us on schedule, so I'm going to welcome to the stage my colleague Corinna Mitchell. She's our general counsel, and she's going to moderate a discussion panel on quantum and cybersecurity with industry leaders. Corinna?
Hi everyone. Did you know this is the International Year of Quantum Science and Technology? Some of you probably knew that, might be news to others. So it's fitting that we have this panel today. We've already heard from Dietmar about Symphony's plans to integrate post-quantum cryptography, try saying that fast, it's a tongue twister, post-quantum cryptography in our production environment by the end of this year. So why are we doing this? Well, quantum computing poses many practical and policy issues for the finance industry, and we're going to explore them today. To do that, we're going to use some of our friends to help us explore the topic. So I'd like to introduce Stewart Hackley from Barclays, Rupert Dennis from the UK Finance, the Financial Services Trade Association, and last but not least, Sandip Wadje from BNP Paribas. Now, a fun fact is that Stewart and Sandip both sit on the Quantum Safe Financial Forum run by Europol, so that's pretty high level. Okay, let's get into it, everyone. So first of all, my question to you all, panel, is why are we worried about this? What's the big hurry? I mean, seems like it could be very, very far away before we get to quantum advantage, so what's all the fuss? Stewart, can you help me?
Well, you've got to plan this. I mean, it might be a long way away, but you've got two risks of the threat of quantum. It's on asymmetric cryptography, which is going to impact your confidentiality and authenticity. So your confidentiality risk exists now for the harvest now, decrypt later.
Okay, so let me just stop you there. What is harvest now, decrypt later? Rupert, can you tell me?
So yeah, harvest now, decrypt later is sort of the idea that principally bad actors are collecting a bunch of sort of information and data that is encrypted with the sort of goal of when a cryptographically relevant quantum computer is available to decrypt it as and when they can. So they're holding on to all of this information.
So that's why Stuart's saying this is the most important piece, is to deal with the encryption. Is that right, Stewart? Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so we do have a problem now, even though we don't know exactly when quantum advantage might occur. But I'm interested in asking you experts. So Sandip, when do you think quantum advantage will occur? And quantum advantage, just in case you all don't know, is the idea that when quantum computing is sufficiently fast enough and sophisticated enough to break existing cryptography methods. So when are we talking about? What's our event horizon?
So I give like a very simple example. When this question is posed to me as to why should we plan for quantum now and why is that sense of urgency. Interestingly, all the major corporations globally were running very well-funded AI projects end of 2022. Nobody went to their board saying starting 2023, we are going to talk something else. So nobody saw ChatGPT coming, and that's the reality. So we don't know when the next tipping point for technology is going to be. But when you know that quantum is as complicated as it can get in terms of rip and replace of your existing infrastructure, you better be prepared. Maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 15 years. But if you look at the foundational technology or data center as a topic, 10 years is still a very small time. And it's not like that Y2K moment. It is way more complicated than that.
So you actually point to something that's very interesting. A lot of financial services businesses have very, shall we say, ancient technology stacks and very complicated technology stacks. So is this a concern for us when we look at quantum computing and post-quantum cryptography? I mean, Stewart, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, transition is always a difficult point, and you want to kind of line bleed your assets as much as possible, but you need to focus on where that risk is going to be. So you don't have to update everything in one go. So when we talk about the harvest now, decrypt later, down to what data do you care about. Not everything is going to be of interest in 10, 15 years' time. So, I mean, if it's, the authentication credentials or material non-public information, that'll all be public, or it's all not relevant in that period of time. So you need to understand what you've got, and different industries will have different impacts. So if you're defence or pharmaceuticals, you've got a lot more IP out there that you need to worry about. So put as mitigations you can put in place now.
Okay, so looking at financial services industry, if we have to pick one area that's the most important to focus on right away, what would you pick? I'm going to ask you, Sandip.
I think making a qualified assumption that nation-state actors already have the quantum infrastructure, and then working backwards, what that means is particularly, and this has been part of our conversation in QSFF with Europol, is assume that telcos and central banks are at a high risk, considering potentially the nation-state actors already have that enough computation power or the quantum infrastructure. So I think that has been the highest priority, and there's a lot of work has happened. So BIS is running a very specific working group just on central banks and telcos to prepare them for this situation.
Okay, and...
But yeah, I mean, also say it's our central coordination between the infrastructures we actually share for the payment schemes, etc. Because we can't do it all by ourselves. It's got to be a coordinated approach, and that's why as a QSFF we're trying to coordinate that. But we need the actual, or everybody to come together for those elements. And the highest risk for me, what I see personally, are the payment schemes going through.
Certainly sounds right to me. I'd be worried if my bank was hacked into, or we had, I think maybe 5-6 years ago, when one of the big clearing banks, its payment systems failed. I don't think it was a hack, they just failed, and people were left on the forecourt not being able to pay for their petrol, they couldn't pay for their groceries or get their food. It's pretty significant. Okay, that makes sense to me. So then, Stewart, you've mentioned this idea of coordination and coming together, and it can't be solved by individual providers. This is a good point, I think, for you, Rupert, to talk about how UK Finance sees things and what you think the approach should be for the industry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, first of all, being quantum safe is not specific to financial services. This is an economic-wide sort of problem that everyone needs to get on board with. But at UK Finance, it is very much an ongoing discussion. Recently we've had the NCSC sort of timeline guidance. It's very much an active conversation in our forums, such as our Cyber Policy Committee. It's very much an active conversation under the CMORG banner, which some of you may be aware of. It's the Cross-Market Operational Resilience Group, which we co-chair with the Bank of England. So the whole quantum conversation is very much like continuing to sort of ramp up, because at the end of the day, it's not just about one organization, it's about the entire sector being on board, moving to being quantum ready and quantum safe.
That sounds hard to do so much coordination. Mm-hmm. Is it possible, do you think, without the additional impetus of clear guidance and practical considerations, perhaps from regulators? Stewart, what do you think?
I think having the regulators coordinating between themselves is important. You've got different regulators coming out with different dates, and for global organisations, that is not helpful. So
what are some of the dates? Give me some examples.
Well, if you're actually looking at, I think the Australian Signals Directorate talk about doing everything by 2030, whereas...
Yes, 5 years.
Yeah, it's not, that's not supply practical. NCSC talk about 2035, but then there's different dates there. And I think the US are also talking 2035, aren't they?
So particularly if you look at emerging technology as a topic, I think it's an evolving or situation for regulators. They're also playing catch-up. AI, quantum, digital assets, and they're all kind of linked to each other if you look at the central infrastructure. Blockchain, for example, you're building all these blockchain use cases, and then PQC, if you haven't done well, it also puts that blockchain infrastructure at risk as well. So I think I would say there is a learning curve for regulators as well on catching up on and staying on top of these topics.
Yeah. Rupert, have you got anything to add there?
No, I completely agree. insofar as, I mean, the regulator typically takes quite a technology agnostic approach to regulation, which particularly with new and emerging tech is quite useful to allow flexibility for organizations. I think, as I sort of mentioned earlier, that the NCSC guidance provides quite a good launch pad for conversation, because it really is everyone on board, because, you know, sector stability is really at the heart of the quantum problem. It's not a problem that one organization can fix.
So with the new administration in the US, I wouldn't say that regulators are technology neutral. That's definitely not the trajectory.
Yes.
We are in a multipolar world, so the reality is there is realization building that technology, if you are using, imposing duties today, tomorrow you can also leverage technology infrastructure to say, hey, you know what, we'll use that against you. So I think there is active conversation on European technology, UK technology. So we can clearly see those trends. Sorry, little bit deviated from the topic. Yeah.
No, but it's interesting because I think a lot of the people sitting here today, and certainly Symphony and Barclays and BNP Paribas are global organizations. And so we have to, when we deploy new technology to solve big problems, we can't do different technologies in different places. It doesn't make any sense. We have to deploy globally. And so having that commonality, at least of basic standards or timelines, is really important in order to get something that's workable in what we hope is the right time. So I do agree that having this idea of competition is not very helpful for our global organizations, at least amongst regulators.
Whilst we're at the timelines don't really help either, because you start looking at IETF, you're talking about maybe 2 years before they come out with a standard. So if that's going to be 2 years from now, 2027, and you've got certain parties saying migrate by 2030, there's no time to deploy new technology, get your investment in there, put labs in place, test it, deploy it. In NCSC, it's talking about 2035 is the latest, but 2031 the same for high-risk systems.
Yeah, so that's pretty soon in terms of technology. I mean, luckily, though, some of the technology exists already. So we know, as Dietmar said, that NIST has published for what it calls quantum-ready algorithms, but that was in August last year. So we've got something to build on. That's what we're doing at Symphony. Some other suppliers have done that, but is that really enough time?
They're also untested.
Yes.
So any algorithm is only as strong as how much public scrutiny it's had. As you said, it was only standardised in August. Do you trust it by itself? No, I don't. But it doesn't mean you can't use it. You can use it in hybrid modes, and that's deployable. That's feasible to do in TLS now on sort of post-quantum key exchange, which is protect against your confidentiality risk. We just don't know what a certificate can look like for the authenticity side yet.
So I'm hearing, even though they're quite new, it's good to start with the NIST algorithms and keep developing it.
This came up in the QSSF on Monday, and my view is unless you make it mandatory from a supplier perspective, it's not going to happen. So there is no way. You look at, we have DORA, we have all that supply chain clarity, and you go around, no one will come on a stage and say, hey, I got lack of visibility on supply chain. But the reality is the financial organizations are still trying to interpret DORA and work it out in terms of the supply chain dependency or the threat intelligence-led testing, etc., etc. But this quantum topic, unless you have a clear regulation and you force third parties and suppliers to do that, it's not going to happen. The transition timelines will not be met.
It certainly seems to be the direction of travel with financial services and technology regulation. So what Sandip is saying is, how do you get suppliers such as ourselves to focus on solving these problems that affect financial services and other key industries? And it's true that regulations do focus minds. We at Symphony, we were developed to help solve regulatory problems. So we like to think we'd be there anyway, but we can certainly see that in supply chains, it has a big impact. I would also observe that having a regulation does tend to permit budget to be provided at different businesses to allow compliance. Yeah, I think that is probably all of our experience. Tell me if you disagree. So that's an interesting point there. So that was actually going to be one of my questions. Do you think technology providers should be required in the future to provide more information and more robust provision in relation to post-quantum encryption and other safe procedures?
We just need them to deploy those algorithms really in that standardised way. The problem is we haven't quite got a fully standardised way yet.
Yeah.
But that, yeah, we probably do need that as that sort of support there to drive those those vendors and application vendors, because we've seen that time and time again. Without regulation, they don't do anything.
Interesting. So this is one area where having competition where people go off and do things all separately and differently is not actually going to advance things for the industry as a whole. Unless you tell me otherwise. What do you think, Rupert?
No, I mean, supply chain visibility as a whole, taking quantum aside, is and continues to be a challenge for organisations. And I think, we see in the EU under DORA having those sort of critical third parties and our very sort of similar regime over here, see awaiting designations. But there is sort of a desire to, bring suppliers into or under the umbrella to allow for more visibility, more data sharing, because again, it is and continues to be a problem. So as for regulatory imperatives, we'll see how the sort of critical third parties regime sort of unfolds. But when it comes to quantum, again, we'll see how that critical third parties regime unfolds, see what sort of impact that has on supply chains and third parties.
Yeah. So the existing legislation doesn't speak to quantum proofing. As a person that has spent a lot of time looking at DORA as we implemented it, readiness for Symphony. So that's an interesting observation, though, that you make there. So then let's focus for a moment on what next. Okay. So there's some different points here. Do we think that it is most useful for, say, technology providers to collaborate with customers, or should we go to industry bodies? Should we talk to regulators more to raise awareness about post-quantum security and how the technology is developing? What would you suggest? I'm going to ask you, Rupert.
Yeah, I think, first of all, there is still a great deal of awareness raising to be done. I mean, there are large organisations such as Barclays who are really at the cutting edge, the forefront, such as yourself. But there are smaller organisations who are less aware of the risks. So very much, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at that awareness raising piece so that we can sort of level the playing field, because it is a sector-wide and industry-wide movement that sort of needs to happen. So yeah, we continue to talk about it, and we will continue to talk about it and bring together our member organisations to do so.
I think industry groups are one way to engage, and I would highly recommend everyone here to go to Europol's website, look at the initial. So I think it was mid last year, right? That's when we launched Quantum Safe Financial Forum. So there was a call to action from Europol on quantum, which is quite broadly socialized in the European community. What we are doing is we are also, as a part of European Financial Roundtable, we are doing a communication to all the chairmen of the 25 largest financial institutions in UK and Europe, saying quantum is a priority and here is why. So I think it's combination of working together. I would highly recommend, I always say this, I think it's always good to have shared understanding of the problem. Otherwise, particularly quantum and AI, there can be very divergent views, because the views can be like, we have different interpretations of what remediation would mean to each stakeholder, right? So industry group working groups, and then also collaborating with the regulators, I would highly recommend.
Yeah, I'd also add to that, I mean, we need to look at the central infrastructures again. I mean, I'll keep banging that drum of covering that, because that's where we all talk to each other, and therefore we need to uplift that infrastructure across. But we don't know when the date's coming.
Yes.
It's just an unknown date. It's Y2K again without knowing the date.
For those of us, such as myself, who are around at Y2K, I certainly remember all the work that people did to be prepared, and thank goodness it all turned out okay. but a lot of work, and we knew the date. This is different. And I suppose we have government actors as well, potentially, and they're not going to be broadcasting when things might be quantum ready or with quantum advantage. So it's better to get started.
We're trying to address that problem. So we approached BT, we approached IBM. We said, you know what, let's all sit together, because this is, I think, the biggest roadblock in a board level conversation. How far are we? And then if you're 15 years away, okay, AI is the highest priority for me. Let's not talk about quantum. And of course, everyone is so busy with AI these days. So unless you get that question out of the way, having actually done some good credible exercise to have that tipping point saying, hey, this is the date or time or some timeline where we think that infrastructure would be available, then we can actually go and have that because I completely agree again, if there is no budget available, how are you going to work on it? And then the only way to make budget available actually is working with technology providers to have some credible timeline as to when commercial quantum infrastructure will be available.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it's something else we've seen in industry. We talked about T+1 earlier at this conference, and obviously we saw T+1 in the US already implemented for equities markets. It's coming in October 2027 for the UK and Europe. And we've seen by setting a date certain, then people realize, okay, we just have to get ready. We are going to get in line for this date. And that is a bit of a forcing mechanism for businesses, for central clearing providers, and for technology providers to get everything ready to be effective on a particular date. So I actually see where you're coming from that, Sandip. It's an interesting one. And so then I'm just going to do a little wrap up and say, let's be optimistic for a minute. What are some of the good things? Because we're all risk people. I'm a lawyer. You're all involved in risk and policy. What are some of the good things that we might see from quantum computing? Just give me your favourite takeaway.
Well, I mean, it's actually knowing what you've got. So this has actually driven a lot of people. I mean, things like DORA as well has driven that. So actually knowing what crypto you've got, whether you've got that sort of flexibility or, crypto agility is now was a word for that. Actually ability to make those changes and put those changes in place. That is actually kind of like, a positive, I think, that's coming out of this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we focus on the risk. I mean, quantum computing as a whole has the potential to revolutionize certain computing problems like medical sort of research and stuff like that. But, fundamentally, the key takeaway is if we're not protected from it, then we're never going to see the benefits from it, because we're all going to be sort of knee deep in a world of pain and trouble. So it has a lot of pros, but risk first approach I think is important as and when we stand now.
Sandip?
So after the ChatGPT movement, one of the things that has happened is people are super excited, and a lot of capital actually has gone on the cheap manufacturing side, on the quantum side, because everyone realizes you now got LLMs, GPUs are getting better. What if we put quantum into the equation? So I think preparing for that hybrid compute journey, where you will have your legacy infrastructure, GPUs, and quantum infrastructure together, is a very interesting topic, I would say, in terms of next 5 to 10 years of journey. And there are certain things like, again, not just quantum-inspired techniques as well. So I'm not trying to promote a company here, but there is a European company which is using quantum-inspired techniques to compact large language models by 90%. And that's a significant breakthrough, because then you're saving power and energy. So I think definitely there are a lot of use cases associated with quantum.
Well, I like to end on a high note, so that's fantastic. So just wrapping up, my observations from all of these experts' input is that we need to start being ready for post-quantum computing. Luckily, a lot of providers are already working on it. A lot of the biggest and best financial institutions and policy think tanks are working on it. Regulators are looking at it. Perhaps we need more guidance and a little bit more connectedness between worldwide regulators about how we prepare for a post-quantum world. But ultimately, we can be prepared, we can solve the risks, and we can reap the benefits. So thank you very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure.